Hello there. What I wanted to do to start this video off was to quote a paper in the Frontiers of Sociology from March of 2021 by Eric Caselas. Yes, sociology. But before I do that, I should clarify that while I'm uploading the videos of this series in the order I think works best, there's no reason you can't watch them in any order you please. So just in case that is the case and you're watching this one first, I'll say that this is a video about transgender people and neurobiology. So naturally, the studies here are going to have small sample sizes, which is pretty typical when talking about brain studies, especially on trans people. But just keep that in mind. I'm doing this because not a lot of people know this information, and knowing it, I think, is somewhat necessary for understanding what makes a person transgender, and of understanding gender and sex more generally. I'll talk about medical and social transition in the next part, but I hope if I can show you nothing else with this video, that I can show you that being trans is an immutable characteristic. So the paper that I mentioned earlier, if you can remember, states that 3 fundamental contributions could build the basis for a dialogue between gender studies and neuroscience on trans research. So what are these contributions? For one, there's the changing of gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria in the DSM-5. DSM-5 describes gender identity and gender roles as spectrums and avoids binary and dichotomous logic, thereby acknowledging the existence of gender identity variants. Furthermore, the term gender has been used instead of sex. Sexual orientation, which was a specifier in the DSM-4, has also been removed. But what makes the DSM-5 so radically different from the previous editions is its shift in the understanding of medical authority. The DSM-5 experts discuss the diagnostic criteria explicitly in relation to the stigmatization of trans people, as well as in relation to access to health care. They challenge that notion that science can define what is regarded as normal or pathological. There are no scientifically based criteria to differentiate normal and pathological gender identity, and the manner in which any gender identity develops remains unknown and a matter of theoretical speculation. The next contribution involves biosocial models of gender development, one of these being Fausto-sterling's theory, and I'm going to be talking about Dr. Fausto-sterling a lot in this video, so fair warning. I don't mean to use her as though she's the ultimate authority on this subject. I'm more using her to help make my own sort of point, thematically, or whatever. First, a quote from one of the researchers that were interviewed in this paper. Fausto-sterling's theory of gender identity development rejected mechanistic and reductionist models. The concept of self could not be in one nucleus deciding if we are male or female as a matter if they are big or small. It must be a network giving us this. And also think the way we see our bodies is also in a network. No matter whether we are gender incongruent or not, how we see our body is formed by a connection between our body and our brain, and how we interpret that. Most central to these biosocial models is the concept of brain plasticity, and how this relates to the development of gender identity. And of the final contribution, Daphne Joel and her team argue that thinking of the brain as dimorphic, that is, as existing in a male or female variation, is a misrepresentation. In a review of more than 1,400 human brains, Jill and her team found that gender and sex differences in the human brain are neither highly dimorphic nor internally consistent. Even when considering only the small group of brain features that show the largest sex and gender differences, each brain is a unique mosaic of features. The same team have also empirically questioned the idea that core gender identity is clearly binary in cis populations. They developed a multi-gender identity questionnaire, administered it to cis and trans participants, and found that the current view of gender identity as binary and unitary does not reflect the gender experiences of many normative individuals. So there's no way I'm going to cover any of these topics in detail in this video. So as I said, we're going to focus on Fausto-sterling's work. I think a helpful frame of reference to achieve that would be looking at some of the places where these ideas originate. Now, there's a whole lot of places we could start here. I suppose we could start with Michael Lewis's work from the 60s. Michael Lewis is a highly prominent scientist in the study of childhood development. In 1967, he wrote, "It is safe to assume that schemata in infants are in flux, changing and being redefined as the infant experiences more of the world around him." This fancy turn of phrase wasn't exactly a new idea. It's likely humans have always understood on some level that experience guides development. Everyone adapts to fit the roles necessary for their survival, and for whatever reason, adopts their own peculiarities, habits, and preferences. We recognize what Lewis was observing was a kind of plasticity in infants, in this case in their responses to certain stimuli. But clearly we need to jump ahead, otherwise we're going to be here all day. So why don't we move along to looking at some things since 2003. A year I choose for no particular reason, honestly. In this year, we can catch up on the research of Fausto-sterling and Linda B. Smith. They state, all intact human infants learn to walk, to progress from making the A not B error to not making it, to speak their native language and to form intense social relationships. But when one looks at the details of development, the picture seems far less deterministic. Children from the same family grow up to be amazingly different from one another. Children with social and economic advantages sometimes fail in life, whereas those from impoverished backgrounds sometimes overcome them. There is a considerable indeterminacy within processes that have a globally similar outcome. These scientists were helping to establish what was a growing perception of human behavior. Cameras would evoke Wolff's criticisms of neo-Darwinian emotional theories, noting that no central program can anticipate all the finer details of form and function, and that said theories impeded investigation by invoking overburdening agents of control. These theories, it was argued, would not include all the relevant data and would often be contradicted by other data. Unexplained variations of responses to the same emotion were similarly ignored. The dynamic systems theory approach to development, then, arose from a number of these problems that were also being addressed similarly in other domains. Sterling and Smith would add that dynamic systems theory is an important part of understanding complex and nonlinear systems in physics and mathematics. And so this would follow a rich tradition of systems thinking in biology and psychology. Human behavior generally involves nonlinear systems, as in systems where the variables to solve for cannot be written as a linear sum of independent components. These nonlinear systems often seem random and chaotic. People, and reality in general, is messy. In a dynamical system, a state is determined by a number of fixed points and periodic points, which can both be attractive, meaning if the system starts in a nearby point, it will converge to a fixed point. Finding precise solutions to equations defining a nonlinear dynamic system is often impossible for us to do, but we can potentially answer questions like, in what ways is the initial starting point for the system a predictor of long-term behavior, and will the system settle down to a steady state, and what are those possible states? This view of behavior is particularly applicable when dealing with infants, as infants are in a constant process of developing, and as such they are more plastic to their environment. Coopers and Nelson in 2006 would acknowledge that the brain is built through neurogenesis, proliferation, and migration, and that though these things are highly gene-driven and thus less plastic than influences from the environment, infants and children produce a lot of synapses, allowing the brain to be more plastic while maintaining those synapses by keeping helpful ones and discarding the rest. The brain adapts to achieve an optimal functioning state, interacting with both itself and the environment. Other scientists like Spencer would contend that dynamic systems theory had emphasized that behavior engaged in over time influenced nervous system structure and set the stage for change. Skipping ahead to 2009, McIntyre and Edwards said that current evidence suggests that major biological influences on individual differences in human gender, to the extent that they exist, operate primarily in early development, during and especially prior to puberty. Biological effects are likely to be mediated by relatively simple processes, like temperament, which are then elaborated through social interactions into more complex gendered features of adult personality. Even stereotyped cultural behaviors have surprising developmental histories, and these processes work on multiple timescales, involving multiple components on multiple epigenetic levels. That's me paraphrasing Susan Jones there. So now hopefully you have a good understanding of dynamic systems theory and cultural psychology, neurobiology, and biosocial developmental theories. So we can finally take a look at Fausto-Sterling's research. She would add to this discussion that sex-related differences in very young children are variable and overlap greatly, and that the distinction of biological and cultural is not clear. Quoting her directly, more complex behavioral differences, especially toy preferences and vocalization, emerge towards the end of the first year of development, and increase in size and stability over the following 2 years. At the same time, boys and girls are exposed to differing stimuli, toys, parental speech, which may affect neural development in a manner productive of observed difference. We illustrate how such small variations, which begin as individual differences, might gradually create an attractor basin we call gender, which then deepens and attracts a variety of behaviors to it. These early differences may contribute to sex differences in developmental problems, especially related to neurological disorders in language, learning, and activity disabilities. Theoretically, we argue that experience itself guides neural and thus behavioral development. So clearly we've come full circle with what we've been talking about, and Fausto-sterling often focuses on the approach we've discussed in regards to the development of gender and sex, gender being what she is more or less defining here. This is helpful to think of when we talk about gender and asking about what gender is exactly and how it differs from sex. In truth, there isn't a whole lot of difference. What we see as sex and gender are defined both by internal and external influences. Fausto-sterling elucidates this view by saying that both sex-related characteristics and gender can be embodied, though neither need to be thought of as inborn or innate. So what does all this mean? Well, gender is often thought of as encompassing the behaviors that are often attributed to one sex and not the other. The production of synapses and environmental influences influence children to learn societally reproduced and enforced gender roles. Essentially, this works because humans have the ability of superior pattern processing. This pattern processing capacity is actually why we're arguably the most dominant species on the planet, because we can transfer the complex patterns we work out to one another. Our brains also change with our environment, and are designed to allow an infant to quickly learn how best to achieve the optimal functioning state, to thrive in whatever environment they find themselves in. So we know how and why this happens to some extent. To help understand these things a little better, let's look at Wood and Eagly's research. 2012 was also the year that Wood and Eagly wrote the paper, Biosocial Construction of Sex Differences and Similarities in Behavior. This paper is, in my opinion, a work of art, so I have to share some of its content with you, or actually a lot of it. It starts by explaining gender in such a way I believe most people would agree with. Gender role expectations, which tend to be consensual within cultures, influence behavior through proximal social, psychological, and biological processes, whereby other people encourage gender-typical behavior and individuals conform to their own gender identities, and hormonal reward and cardiovascular mechanisms enable masculine and feminine behavior. Within societies, the division of labor sets in place a cascade of psychological and social processes. These processes in turn stabilize the current division by making it seem sensibly tailored to the attributes of men and women. Thus, people infer the traits of men and women from observing their behaviors, and they generally regard those traits as intrinsic to each sex. For example, if women care for children, they are thought to be nurturant and caring, and if men fight wars, they are thought to be tough and brave. Such gender role beliefs shared within a society promote socialization practices that encourage children to gain the skills, traits, and preferences that support their society's division of labor. Gender roles encourage most adults to conform to these shared beliefs by confirming others' expectations and by internalizing them as personal standards for their behavior. In addition, biological processes such as hormonal activation support gender role behaviors. By this confluence of biosocial processes, individuals within a society dynamically construct gender in patterns that are tailored to their time, culture, and situation. In this view, the body develops alongside communal inputs, which thereby produce and reproduce gender ideals. The paper includes analysis of several cultural attitudes about gender and how these things play into the biosocial model. For instance, children often believe the difference between male and female to be distinct and innate, but in older children and adults, people recognize that both nature and nurture make up the essences of male and female. In 1997, a questionnaire related to the main reason men and women are different revealed 53% of the respondents endorsed nurture, 31% nature, 13% both, and 3% were not sure, with women generally preferring nurture. Dykman and Eagly found that people believe that women and men have converged in agentic personality attributes and masculine cognitive abilities during the past 50 years, and will continue to converge during the next 50 years, and that the perceived changes in women's attributes over time were due to the perceived differences in the division of labor. Also, When biological differences were presented as scientific fact, men supported more discriminatory practices against women. And people who hold more essentialist ideas about gender are likely to believe in larger stereotypic sex differences in personality and behavior. And greater explanation of group differences by genetic causes is linked to greater sexism. And that men but not women were especially likely to endorse biological explanations of sex differences under conditions in which women were presented as gaining status in society. These papers, among other things, suggest it is women in particular who suffer the consequences of essentialized views of gendered behavior. That's interesting, but it gets even worse than that. Woodard and Eagley continue talking about other studies like these, including that when biological differences were presented as scientific fact, men supported more discriminatory practices against women. Stereotypes as women as communal and men as agentic were weaker in societies with more gender equality. And biological essentialist beliefs give people an especially strong foundation for endorsing their current societal division of labor and promote the maintenance of current social division. Also, the social cost of women's agentic behaviors are especially well documented, and people express more negative reactions when a woman attempts to lead or direct them than when a man does. But it gets even worse than that. Consistent with these findings, women compared with men are penalized for initiating negotiations for a higher salary. Women are also sanctioned for expressing angry emotions and for performing outstandingly in masculine domains. After performing the feminine task of braiding hair, men consistently reduce their discomfort by publicly claiming a conventional heterosexual orientation. After being likened to a girl, men apparently tried to compensate by showing increased strength on a hand grip task. The usual tendency for men to intervene in emergencies and to engage in chivalrous helping weakened when they were alone, and therefore more anonymous compared to when they were joined by an audience of onlookers. The usual tendency for men to aggress more than women in a competitive game situation disappeared when participants were de-individuated, that is, made anonymous. Now, men with stronger masculine identity felt better about themselves after recalling recent interactions in which they acted dominant and assertive, whereas women with a stronger feminine identity felt better after recalling interactions in which they acted nurturant. Gender standards do not, however, always enhance well-being, of course. People may feel that gender role standards are imposed by others so that they are pressured to act in gender-typical ways. Children may also feel pressured by peers and parents to conform to gender role expectations. These external pressures are linked to lowered self-esteem and well-being in adults and children. The specific roles of women and men in a society depend primarily on how the physical differences between the sexes, women's childbearing and nursing of infants, and men's size and strength enable or constrain the efficient performance of everyday activities. Remember that the brain itself has very few sexually dimorphic features, and those that do exist involve auditory processing for speech production, cortical areas involved in speech and motor execution, regulation of circadian rhythms and reproductive cycles, and specific cognitive abilities and motor functioning. The division of labor is the key element to this idea, in that it shows how the brain has evolved to adapt to the process of survival, and how it also adapts to fit that process as we develop. We can use this information in the discussion of gender, seeing why certain actions and beliefs create expectations that themselves influence their continued relevance. These beliefs influence the establishment of a patriarchal society. That is, a society with a gender hierarchy that puts men at the top. This being in spite of the growing understanding of men and women as being more alike than different. I mean, I would hope that we had recognized by now that human differences are a poor basis for an intelligent, self-aware creature to control, hierarchize between, or morally judge other members of its species. Especially when this is in spite of the fact that a more egalitarian view is also more productive. Human beings can survive without being restricted by a dichotomy of behavior. And our continued survival may well lie in the rejection of such ancient dogmatic power structures. But maybe that's an aside, you'll say. So what's the point of going over all this stuff? We understand that the brain is only sexual dimorphic in a very minor way at best, illustrating the massive degree of variability in the human population. And we also understand that humans in their development are somehow affected by gender roles and gendered experiences. It's also safe to say much variation in gender perception exists even in cis population, and that the division of labor and socialization promotes certain kinds of behavior that people then find the most conducive to a functioning society. However, as I said, Humans are more alike than different, and earlier work in this area had many shortcomings. From Fausto-sterling in 2015, the theoretical framework of the majority of earlier work is that sex-related differences in biology provide the foundation on which later sex-related differences are built. In this framework, behavior after birth develops independently, as small biological differences are slowly magnified by environmental influences. Often, environmental influences are not clearly defined, or they are studied under the guise of socialization, which is itself often presented as an external, disembodied concept. The current paper offers a different vision for how to approach future studies of sex-related differences in infancy and beyond. I argue that behavior and biology are different manifestations of the same complex system that includes infant and adult caregivers. Behavioral sex differences gradually emerge from this system during year 1, as infant caregiver dyads produce differently gendered experiences. It is this differently gendered experience and how our brains and our bodies adapt to it that influence not only gender, but also sex. Examples of this differently gendered experience include a number of intentional and unintentional parenting techniques, as well as many other things. In 2013, Fausto-sterling observed the differences in the ways in which male and female infants were disciplined by mothers. One study investigated whether maternal coercion and non-affection during discipline interactions predicted levels of child disruption and aggression, and found that for boys, high coercion and low affection actually was associated with increased aggression over time, suggest increasingly problematic disciplining patterns as boys grow older may be caused by excessively harsh or lax maternal practices. Reeby and others have offered their own findings in this area. While cries were not different between both groups, low-pitched cries were more likely to be attributed to boys, with the analogous pattern in women, and that when they did cry in a low or high pitch, the parents associated those cries with being more masculine or feminine respectively. Also, that low-pitched cries were seen as expressing more discomfort in boys than girls to adult men. So we could keep talking about parenting techniques and gender forever, so let's just look at a few more things rapid fire. Toys are gender stereotyped for all age groups, with less stereotyping in infants and toddler toys. There is evidence that sex segregation, particularly sex-segregated schools, increase gender stereotyping and legitimize institutional sexism. Imagine that. The same infant in a particular situation was seen as displaying different emotions and significantly different levels of emotional arousal, depending on the sex attributed to the infant, the sex of the rater, and the rater's experience with young children. Parents use different forms of gender talk with their children, including use of gender labels, evaluative comments related to gender, and comments about gender stereotypes. Mothers tended to underestimate girls' motor development and to overestimate boys. Also, there is little evidence that gender differences in math skills exist or are innate, much less are relevant to the lack of women's advancement in science, but nation-level implicit stereotypes predicted nation-level sex differences in 8th grade science and mathematics achievement. I could talk a lot more about that one, but perhaps as a topic for a different time. Recent evidence indicates that the linear model of sex is incorrect, and that sex differences arise in response to diverse sex-specific signals originating from inherent differences in the genome, and involve cellular mechanisms that are specific to individual tissues and brain regions. Moreover, sex-specific effects of the environment reciprocally affect biology, sometimes profoundly, and must therefore be integrated into a realistic model of sexual differentiation. So first, we should clarify that what I'm arguing for here is not that human beings can just be raised as whatever gender their parents decide to raise them as. I have to say this for the sake of people desperately seeking to misunderstand the point. Gender is innate in the sense that no one actively chooses what feels right for them. Whether gendered behavior relates more to hormones or socialization or whatever else, which it most likely is different for different people, everyone learns gender in their place in it, but for trans people and non-binary people, as well as some intersex people who are sex reassigned shortly after birth, we find that what we are learning makes no sense to us. It in some way does not apply. Not that you can't be both trans and intersex. Often I find that nowadays scientists like Milton Diamond opine that trans people are intersex, because it's clear trans people's brain sex gives them conflicting information about their assigned gender roles or chromosomes. However, the brain is part of your biology, and is in a sense no less valid as an objective point of reference than any other part of said biology. A slew of anti-trans arguments attempt to draw the line between what is or can be man or woman at chromosomes or genitalia. But there's no good reason the brain should not be part of the equation. The brain is in fact the most important factor in the question of how we experience our sex, as it is at the center of our internal perception. So we understand now how sex and gender are a little more complicated than we might have once thought, being both constructed by nature and nurture. We also understand that human beings and brains are more alike than different, and how gender is constructed by various systems. We further discussed how these different concepts of biological and cultural, nature and nurture, and internal and external, commingle and can be hard to distinguish from when determining the origins of human behavior. We could get a little more into how hormonal and cardiovascular reward play into this picture, but we also understand, as Paileva and others do, that the brain is affected by genetic predisposition, age, sex, sexual hormones, sexual dimorphism in the human brain, cerebral asymmetry, lateralization in brain function, and social and cultural environmental interactive features. We can't really know what the perfect model here is, but if indeed trans people are meant to have the aforementioned unique network in their brains which they interpret as their gender identity, we need to establish that. But how can we test this? For one, we can see if trans brains present such unique networks, and how and if these relate to sexually dimorphic traits, as well as how they respond to hormone treatments, which many trans people pursue. Though again, of course, sexual dimorphism in the brain has much variation, and brains change in relation to environmental factors as well as hormones, age, genetics, etc. And since trans people exist in the same gradient of brain differences, we should expect to see perhaps at best small inclinations towards opposite sex traits in the brains of trans people. Likely, this will be more pronounced in younger trans people, though that might not be easy to show since most studies involve adults. This should also be true in trans people regardless of sexual orientation, and also, while likely distinct from cis homosexuals, of course gender identity and sexuality are intrinsically linked, logically. In one study, when viewing images of their own bodies and bodies morphed in sex towards or opposite birth-assigned sex and rating how much they identified with each image, trans people showed the predictable pattern, of course, and MRI data led the researchers to conclude. Transgender and cisgender participants, regardless of sex, activate similar self-referential networks involving the DMPFC, but the stimuli activating these networks differ, aligning with gender identity and not birth-assigned sex. Moreover, this is not simply an effect of subjective assessments of self-similarity. Treatment-naive transgender participants may also engage greater emotional processing when viewing ambiguous, androgynous images of themselves morph towards their experienced gender identity, and when making decisions as to the degree the images corresponded to their sense of self. In a systematic review of neuroimaging literature, Frigeri and others looked at a total of 51 studies, 30 for the analyses of gender identity and 21 for the analyses of sexual orientation. Our results suggest that some neuroanatomical, neuropsychological, and neurometabolic features in transgender individuals resemble those of their experienced gender, despite the majority resembling those from their natal sex. In homosexual individuals, the majority resemble those of their same-sex heterosexual population, rather than their opposite-sex heterosexual population. In Neuroscience of Transgender People an Update, although the evidence is presently inconsistent, it suggests that while the brain structure, at least before hormonal treatment, is similar to sex assigned at birth, it may shift with hormonal treatment. By contrast, on sex stereotypical tasks, brain function may already be more similar to gender identity in transgender persons, also before receiving gender-affirming hormone treatment. A bit from Collett and others demonstrating the expected lack of consistency. Research has found trans brains resembled the sex assigned at birth, the gender identity, or even suggesting an intermediate phenotype situated between that of their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity, or showcasing a different pattern altogether. From Dick Swab's group in Sexual Differentiation in the Human Brain and Behavior, during the intrauterine period, the human brain develops in the male direction via direct action of a boy's testosterone, and in the female direction through the absence of this hormone in a girl. During this time, gender identity, sexual orientation, and other behaviors are programmed. As sexual differentiation of the genitals takes place in the first 2 months of pregnancy, and sexual differentiation of the brain starts during the second half of pregnancy, these two processes may be influenced independently of each other, resulting in transsexuality. In male to female transsexuals, we found a completely female BSTC. We were able to exclude the possibility that the reversal of sex differences in the BSTC were caused by changing hormone levels in adulthood. The size of the BSTC and the number of neurons match the gender transsexuals feel they belong to, and not the sex of their sexual organs. Important to understand that this is merely an interesting observation, and shouldn't be leaned on as a singular universal causal mechanism. I'm just going to read the title of this one. Cross-sex hormone treatment is linked with a reversal of cerebral patterns associated with gender dysphoria to the baseline of cisgender controls. Here's another from Moody and others. It's a preprint, which means it may not have been peer-reviewed yet, though it's said this for quite a long time now, and usually this process doesn't take that long, so I don't know what's going on there. Patterns of connectivity within frontoparietal and cingulo-opercular networks may provide insights into body-brain effects of hormones affecting one's sense of body congruence. This latent neural organization is linked to response tendencies, processing of stimuli, multisensory integration, and patterns of conscious and unconscious thinking. The most predictive networks in the current study comprise important regions implicated in self-identity, self-referential thinking, as well as supporting top-down control of executive functioning. As these are cognitive control networks, it might point to the directed control of self-referential thought processes with body self-awareness. So that's neat, but maybe not exactly what we're looking for. So let's look for a few more. In a study from back in 2014 led by John Thiessen at Augusta University in Georgia, scientists found 30 genetic variants common among the sample group of trans women that were not common in the general population, with 9 of these variants being known to be implicated in the growth of brain cells or the production of hormones. However, this study wasn't peer-reviewed as far as I know. In a different, more recent and peer-reviewed study from Thiessen, he looks for the presence of rare genetic variants in trans people. Whole exome sequencing revealed 120,582 genetic variants. After filtering, 441 variants and 421 genes remained for further consideration. Of these, 21 variants and 19 genes were found to have associations with previously described estrogen receptor activated pathways of sexually dimorphic brain development. These variants were confirmed by Sanger sequencing. Our findings suggest a new avenue for investigations of genes involved in estrogen signaling pathways related to sexually dimorphic brain development and their relationship to gender dysphoria. A study found that male to female transgender people were much more likely to have a particular variant in the CYP19 testosterone receptor gene than cisgender men. Another study led by Andreas Hahn at the Medical University of Vienna observed differences in hemispheric and lobar connectivity, as well as local efficiencies when compared with non-transgender controls. This study also references previous studies where transgender people show resemblances to control subjects with the same gender identity. This includes local differences in the number of neurons and volume of subcortical nuclei, functional alterations in regional cerebral blood flow and neuronal activation, as well as the ever-popular studies in structural differences of gray and white matter microstructure. So now we've established that trans people do have certain features which show a relationship between brain sex and gender identity. Most people, of course, don't have a good handle on all this. They state things like, science has proven there are only 2 sexes, or you can't change your sex. Fausto-Sterling, in a 2020 opinion article in the New York Times, reveals the problem with this kind of thinking. She references the multi-layered model of sexual development. First, there's chromosomal sex, determined at fertilization when an X or Y-bearing sperm fuses with an X-bearing egg. At least that's what usually happens. Less commonly, an egg or sperm may lack a sex chromosome or have an extra one. The resultant embryo has an uncommon chromosomal sex, say XXY, XYY, or XO. So even considering only the first layer of sex, there are more than just 2 categories. And that's only the first layer. 8 to 12 weeks after conception, an embryo requires fetal gonadal sex. Embryos with a Y chromosome develop embryonic testes. Those with 2 X's form embryonic ovaries. This sets the stage for fetal hormonal sex, when the fetal embryonic testes or ovaries make hormones that further push the embryo's development in either a male or female direction. Fetal hormonal sex orchestrates internal reproductive sex. During the 4th month, fetal hormones complete their job by shaping external genital sex. By birth, then, the baby has 5 layers of sex. But as with chromosomal sex, each subsequent layer does not always become strictly binary. Furthermore, the layers can conflict with one another, with one being binary and the other not. An XX baby can be born with a penis. An XY person can have a vagina, and so on. These kinds of inconsistencies throw a monkey wrench into any plan to assign sex as male or female categorically and in perpetuity, just by looking at a newborn's private parts. Adding to the complexity, the layering does not stop at birth. The adults surrounding a newborn identify sex on how they perceive genital sex, and this begins the process of gender socialization. Fetal hormones also affect brain development, producing yet another layer called brain sex. One aspect of brain sex becomes evident at puberty, when usually certain brain cells stimulate adult male or adult female patterns of hormones that cause adult sexual maturation. What matters then is not the presence or absence of a particular gene, but the balance of power among gene networks, acting together or in a particular sequence. This undermines the possibility of using a simple genetic test to determine true sex. Of course, this is not sufficient for a lot of people. Instead, they might say that intersex people are an exception, or that their being exception does not negate the rule that all these intersex conditions are merely an error in the binary scheme. They misunderstand. The point is, by any definition by which we can determine someone as a member of one sex, that definition can be questioned, as there are exceptions to those supposed rules. And more importantly, no reason that trans people couldn't be included in these rare exceptions either way. No serious person would say that a woman who didn't get her period, or who couldn't bear children, or straight up didn't have a uterus wasn't a woman, as long as that woman is a cis woman. Thus, the foundation of this difference between trans and cis women is reliant on the assumption that trans women are fundamentally not women, this being independent of any specific quality they do or do not have. Trans women not being women is again, just as it was in the last video, something which is just assumed. This inability for trans women to be considered women then is often only justified by trans women not being women, with no self-awareness as to how that logic is clearly circular. We could talk about chromosomes or genitals, gender socialization, secondary sexual characteristics, paraphilic object attachments, or whatever else. But what it is that separates trans women from authenticity doesn't actually matter, because the gender-critical crowd aren't looking to draw conclusions based on what they see. They are looking for justification for what they already believe. I don't think the position is inarguable at all. I hope by the next video you'll see that accepting trans people is arguably the most favorable outcome for everyone. Intersex people are important here. It is true that intersex people have historically been corrected by doctors who determined their ambiguous features to be a medical emergency, largely because of John Money's research. These doctors looked at those who did not fit the model and concluded that living with non-standard equipment was unthinkable. These surgeons, psychologists, and endocrinologists historically attempted to turn the body of these intersex individuals into something more culturally comprehensible. The idea of allowing a person to make such decisions themselves when they are old enough is not considered, and this has led a great deal of intersex people to grow up realizing they did not fit their expected gender roles, and that they didn't agree with these professional opinions about who they were or their decision to be put through a myriad of surgical interventions, often producing heavy scarring and often removing their capacity to ever have an orgasm. Their brains did not align with the supposed experts insisted. People looked at them and said this is what they are probably better off being, producing in them a kind of gender dysphoria. Consider the pure trauma of being lied to and strung along about your body for your entire life. Money did not consider this. He said that you simply couldn't be an it, and that being male or female was all about what external parts you had, as well as how much you looked at them and touched them or something. He was really freaking weird. A change in the view of gender and sex away from essentialist and binary thinking not only validates these people in deciding how they should live and grow, but it also allows all of us more freedom in deciding how we want to live, separating what is man and woman on meaningful lines of self-perception and preference, rather than by what someone else wants to think of our genitals and chromosomes, or whether we adhere exactly to some standard of behavior or appearance. These things only alienate people by reinforcing binary roles that don't reflect what we know about human brains and human bodies, and leads us on a path to discrimination. Trans and intersex people challenge these binary models. If intersex people are rare and represent some error, Do we then correct it? If we think of it as an exception, does that mean we should not treat it as valid as the typical one? It's very common for this information to be reduced under the banner of science wars controversy, insisting this is an argument between academic reasoning and pure ideology. But I should say I agree with Fausto-sterling when she says, "Were biological approaches to stand alone as our sole method of understanding, however interesting they may sometimes be, they would provide impoverished versions indeed of the knowledge systems offered to us by anthropologists, sociologists, and psychologists." Science is a self-correcting process. The idea that trans people are valid is not an aspect of some kind of cultural doctrine that is somehow happening in favor of a tiny minority of people who don't hold systemic power. Trans people being valid is an aspect of a self-correcting process doing just that. Correcting itself, changing definitions, expanding other ones, challenging what is taken for granted as truth. These are things to be celebrated. Inclusiveness is not a bug, but a feature of a perception being updated to include new information and new conceptualizations. You might have a body that isn't as good as other bodies when it comes to performing certain tasks. A piece of you that is present or not present that goes against what people expect. Maybe you were born this way, but it hardly matters. Everyone will inevitably die. If these parts are the only things that make you who you are, what will you become when those things begin to fall apart? There is a deeply rooted system of various experiences which have guided you on the way to develop into the person you are now. That is how you could likewise be better understood, as an individual with independent traits and beliefs and preferences that you both partake in intentionally and have come to adopt unintentionally by accident of birth. If we accept trans identity as originating from a network that results from a rare and peculiar set of sex and gender alignments, we can see that trans people exist as a matter of fact, representing an immutable set of characteristics. Whether we accept these characteristics as good enough for trans women, trans men, and non-binary people to be valid is up to us. It's a mistake to think that the idea of sex can be so easily defined, but even more so that it must have its meaning tightly gatekept behind some of these traits but none of these other traits. When we push to gatekeep humanity, identity, and mere preference to adhere to specific ideals of body and behavior, this only alienates those with bodies that are different from others, bodies which exist and should not be considered as any less valid. I believe there is something deeper to what makes you you. Something more that ought to be considered when it comes to how you are and how you should be.